Hello, Kathy here, and we are back again to look at some principles of composition. First, I'd like to just go over what we've already learned about composition mostly from assignment 2. First of all, that the edges of the picture plane are crucially important to any design, and then some things about line. Whenever you create a line, you break up space into shapes. Line is extremely useful as a pathway through an image, and we can also think of a line in terms of dynamic movement, ways that the eye can move through a composition to desired focal points. So just to review this, one of the really satisfying things that we feel when we look at a Bridget Riley composition like this is the way our eye is moved through the picture. You may find that your eye starts at the top and slides down these wonderful slithering curves. You may find that your eye comes at this from the side and moves back and forth along these very, very three-dimensional looking mountains and valleys that she's created with these contour lines. But however your eye moves, it's a satisfying feeling to know that the artist is controlling your eye in some way, and it does help bring order and unity to a composition. Very easy to see in these elegantly simple compositions by Bridget Riley. We've talked about the fact that unity is extremely important, probably the most important thing to give a feeling of life and soul to a composition. And in this composition, Andy Goldsworthy creates unity by breaking these rocks and then lining them up so that the crack and the scratched white stripe that he has made on them travel continuously across the rocks and seem to almost make them into one form. Andy Goldsworthy is a British artist who typically works with items that he finds in nature. He manipulates them on the site and then photographs them. We've talked, of course, about edges, and Franz Klein's abstract painting is a wonderful illustration of how the artist works off the edges of the picture plane to create dynamic tension. The rule of thirds. I don't really like the word rule, but it's a guideline, and you see it illustrated here in this photograph. This is a really handy thing to try, especially if you are used to working in a symmetrical style. This is a good way to get your compositions kind of on beyond symmetry. And the principle simply is that you imagine your image divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines, and allow the important compositional elements to be placed along these lines and especially at their intersections. This is a very, very handy way to start a sketch for any design project. It isn't a rule in the sense that it guarantees a strong composition, but it certainly does make for a good start, I think. Balance, of course, is what we're thinking about when we talk about something like the rule of thirds. Balance is the arrangement of elements in a design so that one part doesn't overpower the other parts and so that they work together in a satisfying way. We're going to talk here about 3 different kinds of balance: radial, symmetrical, and asymmetrical. Back to Bridget Riley. Radial balance is really a special kind of symmetrical balance where everything is balanced along a central point and the elements radiate, or in this case spiral, out from that central point. This is obviously not a completely radially symmetrical composition, but very, very close to that. And my point is, of course, that something doesn't have to be perfectly radial or perfectly symmetrical in order to partake very powerfully of this kind of balance. In radial balance, an axis drawn in any direction through that central point will result in 2 mirror image halves. More generally, symmetrical balance means that you can draw an imaginary line or axis down through the center of a composition, usually vertically, as in this Van Eyck. And the two sides will be mirror images of each other, or at least identical enough in shape, size, value that we get a very satisfying feeling of symmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance is the type of balance that beginners tend to use. Now, Van Eyck clearly is not a beginner. And my point, of course, is that in the hands of a master, symmetrical balance can be very satisfying, very alive, and very much fun to look at. That's not always the case in beginner compositions, though, and I'd like to suggest that if you're using symmetrical balance because you're afraid to try something more ambitious, it will probably show. I think that symmetry can be a very, very powerful way of giving unity to a composition, but I believe the bar is a little bit higher for symmetrical compositions to be exciting, because symmetry is a bit predictable, right? So you might think, when you find that you're working with symmetry over and over again in your compositional sketches, for example, that ask yourself, why the symmetry? Ask yourself if it's important. Ask yourself if it's necessary. Because asymmetry can be a little bit more exciting. Balance really is just the ability to maintain the center of gravity of a body within the base of support with minimal postural sway, or in other words, without a feeling of falling down or falling apart. When you exercise, you can balance in very asymmetrical poses, as in this illustration. This kind of balance is a more challenging way to relate to gravity. When we look at a gymnast balancing in this way, we feel excited or worried, or we wonder how long will he or she be able to keep that pose? Will they fall? Are they in danger? And that sort of a question grabs our interest a little bit more. I'd like to suggest that although this sort of balance is more difficult, because it's more difficult, it's more interesting. And I'd like to challenge you to try asymmetrical balance in your compositions. Let's look at how that might work. In asymmetrical balance, of course, two sides of a composition don't match each other. And so the sense of balance has to be achieved by arranging the elements in a way that gives a satisfying feeling that their visual weight is similar or equal. Take a look at this Robert Motherwell print and see what you think about its balance. These questions are subjective, of course, but you might ask yourself, this large black shape on the left, is it balanced by these more floating sort of small shapes on the right? You might make the argument that a large shape can be balanced by two small shapes. What about this large orange negative shape? Does it help to balance this possibly heavier black shape? What if this orange shape were white? How would that change the balance of the composition? I can't tell you that you've got to feel that this composition is balanced. As I say, these are subjective feelings, but these are the kinds of questions that you might ask yourself as you try to balance a composition. Imagine that this composition were turned upside down so that the black shape was hanging from the top instead of lying on the bottom. Would that feel top-heavy? Does it feel bottom-heavy now? These are balance questions. In general, I think we can say that proportion does impact balance. Proportion, we also call it scale, describes the relative sizes and the locations of objects in an artwork or anywhere else, I suppose. So the relationships of the size of objects in a composition. So here we see that the brain seems to be too small for the head, out of proportion. A balanced design has an equilibrium of its visually weighted elements. Typically, large objects can be balanced by numerous small objects, so that a visually heavier object can be balanced by a collection of visually lighter ones. Gravity is a feeling that we experience without even thinking about it every day, and we take that experience of gravity with us when we look at works of art. So gravity has a function in our compositions. I myself feel that objects in the top of a composition have a lighter feeling than objects in the bottom. In other words, it's easier to make a composition feel bottom heavy than it is to make it feel top heavy. In this composition, René Magritte is playing with that feeling that we have, that instinct that we have about gravity, and creating tension because we feel that the rock might come crashing down, right? It should come crashing down if this were not a painting. So we can break these rules as artists and designers. We need to understand them and realize that they function in the viewer's mind. Although gravity doesn't really exist in the painting, it really does exist as a force that we can reckon with in the viewer's mind. You might do a thought experiment and lower that rock into the water. Change nothing else in the composition. Leave the blue sky, leave the waves, but just lower the rock. Doesn't the composition feel bottom heavy when you do that? That's my evidence for the idea that different regions of a rectangle, for example, have gravity that operate in them in different ways. So, in conclusion, a bunch of things to think about as you compose your sketches for this assignment. Use the whole space. Think about structure. Think about the edge of the picture plane. You might consider the rule of thirds. That's not a requirement, but if you're having trouble breaking away from symmetry, that is a really good exercise to get you going. Always think about movement. This is something that we'll never outgrow, we'll never leave behind. Don't forget what you learned in assignment 2. Don't forget where you want the viewer's eye to travel. Don't forget to create focal points which give the viewer's eye goals, points of emphasis that the viewer's eye can travel from one to the other. Don't forget to think about visual weight, how gravity functions, and the tension that you can create by playing with the viewer's expectations about gravity. A few other things to remember and think about. Large objects in general tend to be visually heavier than small objects. 2 or more small objects can balance a large one. Dark objects in general tend to be visually heavier than light objects of the same size. A small dark object therefore can balance a large light object. Textured objects generally have a heavier visual weight than smooth ones. An object placed close to a central axis may be visually heavier than a similar object placed near the outer edge of the composition, simply because it's given weight by its clear importance if it's centered in the picture plane. These are some things to think about. As usual, these are guidelines rather than rules, but may help you ask yourself questions that will result in a more satisfying composition for assignment 3. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to see how these principles of balance and composition show up in your work.